Turn your thoughts now from the gilded but violent halls of the royal court. Move away from the world of assassinations, civil wars, and the endless division of kingdoms. Journey instead into the quiet, forested heartlands of 6th and 7th century Gaul, where a different kind of power was taking root. In an age of profound chaos and political instability, small islands of extreme order began to appear. These were the monasteries of the Merovingian age, and the form of faith practiced within their walls was often as strange, as harsh, and as uncompromising as the world outside was lawless. This was not the pragmatic, political Christianity of kings like Clovis. This was a radical, all-consuming piety, one that would have a deep and lasting impact on the soul of the emerging European world. To understand the unique character of early Merovingian monasticism, you must first look not to Rome, but to the windswept green island of Ireland. Ireland lay beyond the reach of the Roman legions. It had never been conquered, never been part of the imperial system. As a result, when Christianity took root there, it developed a unique character, one profoundly different from the form that had evolved in the rest of Europe. Roman Christianity was episcopal, centered on a clear hierarchy of bishops who governed dioceses based on the old Roman city districts. Irish Christianity was monastic. Its power centers were not cathedrals in bustling cities, but great, sprawling monastic communities in the remote countryside, ruled by powerful abbots who were often more influential than any bishop. From these vibrant, learned, and intensely spiritual communities, a new kind of religious figure emerged in the late 6th century, the peregrinus, or the wandering saint. These were Irish monks who undertook a radical form of spiritual asceticism, known as peregrinatio pro Christo, wandering for Christ. It was a self-imposed exile, a white martyrdom, where one gave up the comfort of home and kin not to die for the faith, but to live for it in a state of perpetual alienation. They set out in small boats, letting the wind and currents take them where they would, seeking a spiritual desert in the vast ocean of the world. Their primary goal was not to convert pagans, though they were remarkably successful at it, but to achieve personal salvation through hardship and displacement. The most famous, most formidable, and most influential of these wandering saints was a man named Columbanus. He was a towering figure, both physically and intellectually. Born in Ireland around 543, he was a product of the great Irish monastic schools, deeply learned in scripture and the classics, but he was also possessed of a fiery, uncompromising, and often abrasive personality. In approximately the year 590, when he was already a man in middle age, he and 12 companions set out from Ireland and landed on the coast of Gaul. He found a kingdom that was Christian in name, but whose royal court was, in his eyes, a hotbed of sin and corruption, and whose local clergy were often lazy and complacent. Columbanus was not a gentle diplomat. He was a prophet from the wilderness, and he spoke with a thunderous voice. He clashed frequently with the Frankish bishops, whose authority he largely ignored, and he did not hesitate to condemn the moral failings of the Merovingian kings and queens directly to their faces. He famously rebuked Queen Brunhilde for encouraging her grandson, the king, to take concubines instead of a lawful wife. His audacity was astonishing, and it frequently led to his exile. But his personal holiness, his fierce intellect, and the sheer force of his will were so impressive that he always found new patrons. The kind of monasticism he brought with him was as harsh and demanding as his personality. It was codified in his own monastic rule, the rule of Saint Columbanus, which for a time became far more influential in Gaul than the more moderate, balanced rule of Saint Benedict that would eventually triumph in Europe. If the Benedictine motto was ora et labora, prayer and work, a balanced life of contemplation and manual labor. The spirit of the Columbanian rule was one of unceasing penance and radical self-denial. It was designed to break the will and discipline the body in order to liberate the soul. Life in a Columbanian monastery was one of extreme asceticism. The monks practiced constant fasting, endured long vigils of prayer in unheated chapels, and slept only a few hours a night. The rule demanded absolute and unquestioning obedience to the abbot. But its most distinctive feature was its detailed penal code, or penitential. This was an exhaustive list of sins and their corresponding punishments, which were almost always corporal. It prescribed a specific number of lashes for every conceivable infraction. Forgetting to say amen at the end of a prayer might earn you 10 lashes. Speaking without permission during meals, 6 lashes. Coughing during the chanting of a psalm, another 6. Arguing with another brother could result in 200 lashes, or being forced to observe a strict silence for an extended period. This was not seen as brutality. It was spiritual medicine, a harsh but necessary therapy to cure the soul of the disease of sin. Along with this harsh discipline, the Irish monks brought with them a practice that would revolutionize the spiritual life of Europe: private confession. In the early Roman Church, confession was a public affair, reserved for only the most grievous sins, like murder or adultery, and it could typically only be done once in a lifetime. The Irish, however, developed a system of regular private confession of sins to a priest, who would then act as a animi medicus, a soul doctor, prescribing a specific penance to heal the spiritual ailment. This practice of frequent, private confession and penance, first introduced to the continent by Columbanus and his followers, would eventually be adopted by the entire Western Church and remains a cornerstone of Catholic practice to this day. Despite the extreme harshness of his rule and his frequent clashes with the established powers, Columbanus's movement spread like wildfire. The Merovingian aristocracy, a warrior class whose lives were steeped in violence and sin, were powerfully drawn to this intense and authentic form of piety. They saw in these holy men a path to salvation. Founding a monastery became the ultimate act of aristocratic patronage. A noble would donate a vast tract of land, often in a remote, forested area, to a group of wandering monks. He did this to atone for his own sins, to secure the unceasing prayers of the monks for his soul and the souls of his family, and to create a spiritual stronghold that would also serve as a family mausoleum and a legacy for his lineage. Columbanus himself founded several hugely influential monasteries, most notably Luxeuil, in the foothills of the Vosges Mountains in Burgundy, established on the site of abandoned Roman baths. From Luxeuil, a new generation of his disciples went out to found hundreds of other monasteries across the Frankish kingdoms, all following his rigorous rule. These communities became centers of learning, with scriptoriums that painstakingly copied and preserved not just the Bible, but also the works of classical pagan authors. They became centers of economic power, transforming wilderness into productive agricultural land, and they became deeply intertwined with the Merovingian nobility, often serving as a respectable place of retirement for unmarried daughters or younger sons with no hope of inheritance. But this very success created a fundamental tension within the Frankish Church. These powerful, autonomous, and hugely popular Irish-style monasteries often operated as a parallel authority, independent of the local Gallo-Roman bishops. They followed their own rules, calculated the date of Easter according to the Irish custom, and answered to their own abbots, not to the diocesan structure of the Roman Church. A new and vibrant spiritual force had entered the kingdom, but it did not fit neatly into the existing order. How would the established church, with its hierarchy of bishops and its deep institutional roots in the old imperial system, respond to this wave of fierce, independent, and wildly successful Irish monasticism? Could these two competing visions of the Christian life, one episcopal and Roman, the other monastic and Celtic, continue to coexist, or was a conflict for the soul of the Frankish Church inevitable? The vast and wealthy monastic network of the Merovingian kingdom, for all its spiritual power, was on a collision course with the rising secular authority of the mayors of the palace. The Pippinid mayors, particularly the formidable Charles Martel, faced a fundamental logistical problem. Their power rested upon the loyalty of a new kind of army, a professional force of mounted warriors, the predecessors of the medieval knight. Maintaining such a force was ruinously expensive. These warriors needed land, or fiefs, to support themselves, their families, their horses, and their equipment. The kings, after centuries of civil war and buying the loyalty of nobles, had already given away most of the royal domain. When Charles Martel looked across the kingdom for a source of land to fund his military machine, his eyes inevitably fell upon the single largest landowner in all of Gaul, the Church. What followed was not a war against the Church, but a pragmatic and systematic appropriation of its resources. Charles Martel, the hammer who saved Christendom at the Battle of Tours, was also the man who began the large-scale secularization of monastic property. In his view, this was a matter of state necessity. He would either directly confiscate the estates of a wealthy abbey and grant them to his loyal military followers, or he would employ a more subtle method. He would appoint one of his trusted warriors or relatives as a lay abbot. You must picture this strange and uniquely medieval arrangement. A lay abbot was a powerful nobleman, a soldier, not a man of the cloth. He would be installed as the head of a monastery, giving him complete control over its immense wealth, its sprawling lands, and its agricultural revenues. He would then use this income to fund his own military retinue and to fulfill his service to the mayor. The monks of the community were often left with a small stipend, a small portion of their own estates, sufficient for them to continue their daily round of prayers and to maintain the chapel. The monastery, from a practical standpoint, had been transformed into a military and financial asset of the Pippinid regime. This policy made Charles Martel the most powerful ruler in Europe, but it also earned him the undying enmity of a generation of churchmen. In later chronicles, written by monks, Charles, despite his celebrated victory over the Umayyads, is often condemned as a despoiler of the church, a man whose soul was damned to hell for his This tense and exploitative relationship could not last. Charles Martel's son Pepin, the Short, and his grandson, the great Charlemagne, understood that a lasting dynasty could not be built in opposition to the church. They needed its spiritual authority, its administrative skills, and its power to legitimize their rule. This understanding led to the great Carolingian monastic reform, a movement that would profoundly reshape the character of religious life in Europe. The foundation of this reform was the new, powerful alliance between the Carolingian dynasty and the papacy in Rome, when Pope Zachary gave Pepin the Short his blessing to depose the last Merovingian king. He forged a partnership. The Carolingians would be the sword and shield of the papacy, its military protectors against the Lombards and other enemies. In return, the Pope would provide the sacred oil and the spiritual sanction that made the Carolingians God's chosen kings. The architect of this reform on the ground was Saint Boniface, an Anglo-Saxon missionary who was granted authority by the Pope to reorganize the Frankish Church. Boniface, a man of immense energy and a deep devotion to Roman order, was appalled by what he saw in Gaul. He saw a church that was disorderly and decentralized, a clergy that was often corrupt, and a monastic world of competing rules and customs. His great mission, backed by the full power of the new Carolingian kings, was to clean it up, to impose uniformity, and to bring the entire Frankish Church into disciplined submission to the authority of the Pope in Rome. This Carolingian reform marked the decisive end of the Irish influence that had been so powerful in the Merovingian era. The unique Celtic customs, such as their different method of calculating the date of Easter and the fierce independence of their abbots from episcopal control, were systematically suppressed. The diverse and eclectic mixed rules that had governed the Merovingian monasteries were gradually replaced by a single, universal standard, the rule of Saint Benedict. Charlemagne would eventually make the adoption of the Benedictine rule mandatory for every monastery in his vast empire. This move was about more than just religious practice. It was a political act. It brought every monastery in the kingdom under a predictable uniform, and controllable system, ending the era of the fiercely autonomous monastic princes. The character of the monastery itself began to change. The Carolingian monastery was, in many ways, a different institution from its Merovingian predecessor. It was less of a private, spiritual stronghold for an aristocratic family, and more of an integrated part of the imperial state. The primary duties of the monks were now to pray for the health of the emperor and the stability of the realm. The great imperial abbeys became vital centers for the Carolingian Renaissance, a state-sponsored cultural renewal. Their scriptoriums produced beautiful new copies of the Bible and classical texts, all written in a clear, standardized script known as Carolingian, minuscule. Their schools trained the educated administrators and clerics that the sprawling imperial government desperately needed. The wild, untamed, deeply personal, and sometimes chaotic piety of the Merovingian era was replaced by the disciplined, orderly, and public-minded spirit of the Benedictine system, all in service to the new imperial project. The story of the Merovingian monasteries is thus a story of a brilliant but ephemeral culture. Born from the fusion of Irish spiritual fire and Frankish aristocratic ambition, these communities became the spiritual and intellectual heart of their age. They preserved learning through the darkest of times, and they created a unique and powerful role for noble women as the rulers of their own spiritual domains. But their very success, their independence, and their immense landed wealth made them an obstacle to the next great political force in Frankish history. The monasteries were not destroyed by the Carolingians. They were reformed, tamed, and repurposed. Their story is a quiet but powerful illustration of a recurring historical theme in the long, often silent struggle between spiritual institutions and secular power. It is often the state that succeeds in reshaping the church to serve its own needs. The wild, overgrown, and beautiful garden of Merovingian piety was, in the end, neatly trimmed, organized, and replanted to fit the grand, orderly designs of a new empire. The tension between the disciplined, Roman-style Episcopal Church and the wild, ascetic energy of the Irish monks did not, in the end, result in a dramatic schism or a decisive victory for one side. Instead, in a characteristically Frankish solution, the two traditions began to merge, creating a unique and powerful hybrid form of monastic life. For several decades in the 7th century, it became common practice for a new monastery not to choose one rule over the other, but to adopt what is now known as a regular mixture, or a mixed rule. An abbot, when founding a new community, would draw from both traditions. He might take the harsh penitential code and the emphasis on learning from the rule of Saint Columbanus, but combine it with the organizational structure, moderation, and emphasis on stability found in the rule of Saint Benedict. This fusion created a form of monasticism that was perfectly suited to the Merovingian temperament. It was intensely spiritual and physically demanding, satisfying the aristocratic desire for grand acts of ascetic piety. But it was also well organized, stable, and governable, which made it a reliable and attractive institution for royal and noble patrons to support. The raw spiritual energy of the Irish Peregrini was captured and harnessed within the more sustainable framework of Benedictine order. This compromise allowed Frankish monasticism to flourish, becoming one of the most vibrant and powerful forces in the kingdom. Out of this fertile ground grew another institution unique to the era, the double monastery. You must picture a single, sprawling monastic foundation that contained two distinct and separate communities, one of monks and one of nuns. They would live in separate cloisters, work in separate fields, and pray in separate chapels. But they existed under the authority of a single ruler, and, in a remarkable expression of the power of aristocratic women in this period, the ruler of these great and influential institutions was very often a woman, the abbess. These Merovingian abbesses were some of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. They were almost invariably women of the highest noble or even royal blood. a princess who was not needed for a strategic marriage alliance, or a widowed queen, might become the abbess of a great monastery founded by her family. From this position, she wielded immense power. She controlled vast tracts of land, sometimes larger than the domains of many dukes or counts. She managed complex economic enterprises, from farming and brewing to the production of salt and the copying of manuscripts. She was the spiritual guide for hundreds of monks and nuns under her care, and she was a major political player, corresponding with kings, bishops, and even the Pope. The double monastery became a unique sphere where aristocratic women could exercise a degree of autonomy and authority that was unavailable to them anywhere else in society. Great foundations like the Abbey of Chelles, founded near Paris by the former slave girl turned queen, Balthild, or the Abbey of Nivelles in modern Belgium, ruled by Saint Gertrude of Nivelles, a direct ancestor of the Carolingian dynasty, were major centers of power, wealth, and learning. This highlights the true nature of these institutions in the Merovingian world. They were not, as you might imagine, humble refuges for the poor and devout. They were, in essence, private spiritual corporations, founded and controlled by the great aristocratic families. They were what German historians call Eigenkloster, proprietary monasteries. A powerful noble family would found an abbey on their own lands, endow it with immense wealth, and then ensure that the position of abbot or abbess was kept within the family for generations. The monasteries served multiple vital functions for the aristocratic clan. It was a safe and prestigious place to provide for surplus family members, younger sons who would not inherit the main titles, and unmarried daughters who were not destined for a political marriage. It also served as a very comfortable and respectable form of political prison or retirement home. A king on the losing side of a civil war, once his hair was shorn, would be sent to a monastery. A disgraced queen, or a noble who had backed the wrong faction, might also find themselves retiring to a monastic life. But most importantly, the monastery became the spiritual heart of the family's identity. It was where the family's history was recorded, where their charters and legal documents were stored. It served as the family's official burial place, and the central duty of the monks and nuns was to practice memoria, the perpetual prayer for the souls of their deceased patrons, ensuring the salvation of the clan. This deep integration with the aristocracy also shaped the very idea of what it meant to be a saint in the Merovingian age. When you read the lives of the saints from this period, a hugely popular literary genre, known as hagiography, you quickly realize that sanctity was seen as an almost hereditary quality, a feature of noble blood. The saints of this era were almost without exception members of the ruling class. They were pious kings like Guntram of Burgundy, martyred princes like Dagobert II, or powerful bishops and abbesses from great families. The age of martyrdom for the faith was long over. The new path to sainthood was through grand acts of aristocratic piety, founding and endowing a monastery, renouncing worldly power to live as a monk or hermit, or ruling as a just and holy bishop. The written vita, or lives, of these saints were not objective biographies. They were works of spiritual propaganda, designed to provide a moral example for the faithful, and, just as importantly, to promote the cult of the saint. A successful saint's cult centered on the veneration of their physical relics, a piece of bone, a lock of hair, a fragment of clothing, brought immense prestige to the monastery that housed them. It attracted pilgrims from across the kingdom, and these pilgrims brought with them donations, enriching the monastery and extending its influence. These stories were filled with recurring themes. The saint is born to a noble family, shows signs of holiness from a young age, fights off temptations that often appear in the form of literal demons, performs miracles like healing the sick or controlling wild animals, and dies a holy death, often with the scent of lilies filling the room. They were a formula, but a powerful one that shaped the religious imagination of the age. Thus, by the end of the 7th century, the monastic landscape of Gaul had become a dominant feature of the kingdom. It was a vast, wealthy, and powerful network of hundreds of institutions, deeply woven into the fabric of aristocratic life. These monasteries preserved learning, cleared forests, organized agriculture, and served as the spiritual bedrock of the Merovingian world. Their success was a testament to their ability to adapt the fierce piety of the Irish missionaries to the social and political needs of the Frankish nobility. But this very success, the accumulation of immense tracts of land and untold wealth, made them a tempting target. As the power of the kings continued to wane, and the mayors of the palace grew ever more powerful and hungry for resources, the great, tax-exempt estates of the monasteries began to look less like sacred trusts and more like untapped assets. What would happen when the secular power, desperate for land to reward its loyal warriors, began to look upon the vast wealth of the church, not with piety, but with pragmatic envy? Could the very institutions designed to be a refuge from the world survive when the world, in the person of an ambitious and unsentimental mayor like Charles Martel, came knocking at the monastery gates?